Hey, this is Derek. I'm going to make a really quick video talking about point of view, which is POV, and also tense. I'm not going to go too deep in the weeds here, but it is kind of important to bring up because a lot of people will start writing a novel and not be really clear how they're telling the story or who is telling the story. And it's important because consistency matters. So no matter what you use to write your novel, you have to be consistent so that it makes sense to the readers. So let's start with tense, which is basically just, is this present tense happening in the moment, or is this past tense, has it already happened? The vast majority of genre fiction or commercial fiction is written in simple past tense, which just means most of the verbs that you're going to use will be in simple past tense. I went to the bookstore, he looked at the clock to see what time it is, she drank from her mimosa after the noonday brunch. There are a few genres, for example, some young adult or young adult fantasy will write in present tense. Present tense can seem a little more exciting and a little more immediate. Like, I ran down the hall and then I actually screwed that up. So it should be, I run down the hall and I see a werewolf. The werewolf jumps out in front of me. I am scared. It's difficult for me because I'm not used to writing like that. It's a little bit more of the like choose your own adventure style. It could work well for some types of horror or young adult. But it's probably like maybe 10% of genre fiction. So the main thing is you want to do whatever is easier for you to do, but is also the most universal and familiar to readers. Because the harder it is for you to do, or the more that it takes readers out of the narrative, that's going to cause problems. So I would suggest trying to start with simple past tense. So the other really big decision is there are two main types of point of views. The first is first person, and with first person you're basically getting in the head of your main protagonist or main character and you're talking in the I. And I actually wrote a couple little examples, so I might look over my shoulder and read these out. But a first person simple past would sound like this. I walked alone down the rainy street, careful not to get my heels wet, even though my hands were stained with blood. He deserved it, I thought. There's nothing else I could have done. I tucked my hands into my pockets as the man on the corner watched me pass, ducking my head as he waved hello, careful to step over the broken glass left from last night's drunk tourists. So you're describing the scene as if you were the main character. And even though it's unfolding, even though it's in past tense, it's kind of like it's already happened. The character is describing how it happened. It's written in past tense, but it's developing as if she doesn't know what happens next. It follows a linear timeline. I actually think writing in first person is easier, and I would recommend you start with that. I had trouble writing fiction until I figured out that it's easier to do it in first person because it's a lot like writing a journal or an essay, something you've probably experienced before. So it's more of a style you're probably already familiar with. The main challenge of first person is you really have to stick with one main protagonist for the whole book, basically. I've seen books where they try to jump POVs, where you're using first person, but you're jumping POVs to other characters. You might start a few chapters and you start off with, I went here, I did this, but then you switch to another character somewhere else and you continue with, I went here, I did this. It can be a little jarring for readers, and it's possible to label like at the top of your chapters, chapter 1, James, and then chapter 2, Annabelle, and you go back and forth. Or you might have like the character who's speaking and the time and the place so that they can see where this is starting and who is speaking. Even so, I think jumping POV like that can be confusing, and I probably would try to stay away from it. The other thing I see people ask is, what if I have one POV character for book 1 and then I want to shift to another POV character for book 2? That's also something I would try to avoid. Especially because often people will try to do something like, I'm going to do the protagonist for one book and then I'm going to do the antagonist for another book, and then I'm going to show how it all comes together. once you get readers invested in a story and a character told from a certain point of view, they aren't gonna keep going with that story if you pull a bait and switch. And I talked a little bit about this in my last video, which was about the drama and the conflict, but it's difficult to get their buy-in by starting the story and building things into the story so that they feel sympathetic to your main character, whoever's telling the story, and they slowly care about what's happening. So when you switch POV, you're basically asking them to start over with someone new, which can be really jarring. You can't assume that because they've read 3 chapters or a full novel, you can't assume that they're going to follow you to jump into a new character told from a different point of view. So when people talk about like a series, generally that's the whole story, one story told from one main point of view. So if you're jumping characters or doing POV hopping, there are examples of authors who have done it successfully. I've also seen a few young adult romances that hop POVs going from the guy character to the girl character. And the advantage is you can reveal more information that way coming from both angles and slowly come together. It can be really satisfying when it's done really well, but it's hard. If you don't have a lot of experience writing fiction, if you haven't published a lot of successful books already, I wouldn't try to challenge yourself by doing something that is harder, that takes more skill and writing craft to get right, because the harder you make it for yourself, the less likely it's going to be for you to produce a successful novel. I would start with the easy things, which, like I said, is simple past tense, first person point of view. But the other point of view that's very common in genre fiction is third person. And in third person, kind of you as a narrator are talking about all the characters. So it's not limited to one particular character's actions or thoughts or deeds. And depending on the genre, this might be more common. So in thrillers or in epic fantasy, third person is more common. So I'm going to try to read that same example I had earlier in first person and switch to third person. Alicia walked alone down the rainy street, careful not to get her heels wet, even though her hands were stained with blood. He deserved it, she thought. There's nothing else I could have done. The man on the corner watched her pass, waving hello as he cleaned up the broken glass from last night's drunk tourist. He knew his wife would expect a clean storefront before they opened up for the 9 a.m. rush. So this is basically the same thing, except instead of I walked alone down the rainy street, it's Alicia walked alone down the rainy street. Instead of I, it's her and she or he. And the interesting thing is when I'm talking in third person, rather than sticking a close camera on Alicia and only being able to hear her thoughts, I can also add some extra information. So for example, he knew his wife would expect a clean storefront before they open for a 9 a.m. rush. I can add that as a narrator, even if it's not necessary. But if I was talking in first person, Alicia couldn't know that information because she wouldn't know what was going on in the storefront shop owner's head. So you can add in more information about more characters. It's a little tricky to add thoughts. So with third person, you can do omniscient or limited. Omniscient means you're basically all-knowing and you can read everybody's mind. Or you can try to do third person limited, which is you kind of know what's going on, but you can't really project extra information outside of what the characters themselves know. So I could still comment on what each character is doing and maybe what each character is thinking, but I couldn't extrapolate huge big picture world stuff. And again, in that last video I made about conflict and suspense, the main problem most authors make when they're starting off is that they add in all of this extra backstory and information that's not coming from the characters. So if the characters aren't doing it or thinking about it, it's just the narrator talking directly to the readers, which means basically you've set up a scene and then the characters have to just stand there and be quiet while the narrator talks directly to the readers about some extra information or backstory, which will slow down your action. So you want to be careful about not adding that kind of backstory in unless it's directly relevant to what some of the characters are doing. So your characters should be doing things which might make them think about things, and as narrator, you might be able to comment on what they're thinking about. But you don't want to have them randomly thinking about old backstory stuff if it doesn't, like, people won't be thinking about past childhood trauma unless they're in a stressful situation that makes them bring it up. They feel really bad, or they have time to think about it, or something happens that makes them think about what happened years ago that they probably filed away. And if they're ever in like stress or danger, they will be thinking about the most common pressing problem right now, not the backstory stuff. So you have to be careful about, is it believable for your characters to be thinking about this stuff right now? Also, those two examples I read for you, you can't see it, but those thinking passages where Alicia says, he deserved it, I thought, there's nothing else I could have done. Those are thoughts. I put my thoughts in italics. I would put speech in dialogue quotes. You need to be careful to open dialogue quotes. While I'm on the topic, another common problem is not using dialogue tags well, which just means when someone says something, you need to probably end it with he said or she said. But you also want to be careful about not using random other words instead of he said or she said, because what happens is if you start adding in clever words like she commented, she opined, she shouted, anything that's not he said, she said, it draws more attention. It can be used, but what's probably going to happen is if you're trying to avoid using he said, she said, you'll add in all these other strange words, and the more you use strange words, the more that they stick out. So you can use an unusual word choice every once in a while, but if you use it 2 or 3 times, it's really going to start to stand out and be distracting. So the advantage of just using he said, she said is that it disappears. It lets people know who's speaking, but it doesn't grab attention. And the verb for saying things is not the point. The dialogue is the point, or the action. It's also a really good idea to, between dialogue tags, to add in a little bit of movement. So when you do scene description, and we'll talk more about scene description later, but you can add in scene description by talking about how the characters are relating or interacting with their environment, but you also want it to be tied to action, which can be speech. So in the middle of the dialogue, she said, wiping the blood off her sandals, or grabbing a coffee cup and doing something. You can break up the description by adding in action. My point though was that you can add in thoughts with italics. And actually, if you're using first person, he deserved it, I thought, there's nothing else I could have done, I would actually even delete that I thought. If you're talking in first person, it's clear who is doing the talking, and you can just add a thought in italics, and you don't have to tell readers, I thought, that she's thinking. That'll be clear from the punctuation. I'd also, though, be careful about not having your characters in their heads too much. I see a lot of first chapters where characters will just be thinking to themselves, or they'll be talking out loud to themselves, like commenting on what's happening, and that's something I would try to avoid, because that usually signifies weak writing, because it means that nothing is really happening. If they're just thinking to themselves or talking to themselves, not only is it not very believable, because most people don't go around talking to themselves or thinking out loud to themselves in that way. Most people, they might be thinking all the time, but they're probably not thinking in terms of like having a discussion with themselves. So you might have like a couple phrases of italics, maybe once a page, maybe a couple times a page, but when you start having like paragraphs of italics where she's just thinking to herself for paragraphs, that's a big red flag. I try to avoid that much thinking, because it means nothing is really happening, at least in the beginning. In the beginning, until there's stuff happening and until you've introduced your characters, you don't want them thinking very much, because nothing they're thinking should be interesting enough to engage readers, because nothing's really happened yet. And if they're just thinking about all their backstory, that's not interesting to readers yet. I will say I'm almost done with this vampire novel, and at the end of it, I probably have about a page of, it's not thinking, but it's exposition, where she's kind of reflecting, because, you know, this is towards the end of book 2, where a lot of stuff has happened, and she has to make some really difficult decisions about, you know, big world-changing matters. So she's got a lot of emotions, she's got a lot of things to process. So in that instance, it's kind of okay to have her affirm the stakes, like what's at stake, why does this matter, why do these choices she's making matter to her and to the larger world. It's okay because it's about to go into a heavy action final battle scene. So she's kind of just repeating, you know, what's the point of all this conflict? So that's basically all I wanted to say in this video. You should probably pick first person, simple past, or third person, simple past. I wouldn't worry too much about omniscient or limited. You could look up those and kind of see what the differences are, but mostly you do what's comfortable. We're gonna start just writing a first draft, and I'm gonna talk about some writing strategies to write faster. And the main thing I'm gonna say is you just have to get some content down. However, you wanna be making some choices on purpose, which will really help during the editing phases later. I've edited books where they switch from present tense to past tense. I've even written books where I switch accidentally and then I have to go back and be really careful about editing them. But you want to try to be as consistent as possible. I'll also mention third person may seem more attractive because it gives you a lot more freedom, because you can, you know, go anywhere, but it also makes it harder to get readers to care about what's happening because it's a little bit further out. So like if you're writing epic fantasy and you're talking about, you know, the races and the nations and thousands of years of history and epic battles, people don't care about what's happening unless it's tied to a specific character up close. So if you are zoomed out too far with your camera, it's going to be harder. You may show a lot of cool things, but readers may not care about what's actually happening. And also if you're jumping between, you know, you start off with your main characters, but then you jump somewhere else and you talk about some other characters, you're kind of starting the story all over again. You'll lose readers' interest really quickly if you're leaving your main characters behind and introducing a bunch of new content, you know, and they're not sure how it's related. Eventually with third person, you can jump around and eventually they'll all come back together again, but you don't want to leave your main storyline or the main character plot line too long. You don't want to go off somewhere else and then come back to them later. They're basically just standing there waiting, and readers may feel, you know, they're going to want to get back to the story pretty quickly. So if you're doing third person POV jumping to build this really large story, you might be losing focus on the real conflict or the real story development or who the actual main character is. So that can be a limitation of third person. I personally prefer first person, but both of those would be okay choices.